Hello, welcome to video number 2 of my Intro to React 18. And in this video, we're going to focus on JSX and sort of like the rules of JSX. Because there's lots of rules. JSX is not traditional HTML. It's not like there are rules that are unique to JSX, and you need to know that, hey, technically, everything in like this parentheses here is essentially a value, okay? Because again, you're not actually writing HTML. This is being converted into like different JavaScript calls under the hood. So for React to do that translation appropriately and be able to understand it enough to make that translation under the hood, we need to follow its rules. Okay, so I mean, just to kind of give you an example, let me do this. If I do it right here, console.log, h1 hello world. So again, to me, this looks like HTML, but it's really JSX. Now watch what happens when I console log that and I look in the terminal. Okay, I get this object. Okay, and you see what that JSX is this object that is a result of like this React act. You get this really complicated object, and that's what it's creating. Okay, and generally what's going to happen is if you have multiple like HTML elements, there's an object inside the object for each HTML element you designated. Okay, and then JavaScript is using these objects to kind of determine what's on the screen. Okay, they're like a blueprint. Hey, this is what I need to paint on in the actual HTML. So just keep that in mind, that even though you look like you're writing HTML, React is doing a lot of this work for you, and that's why you have certain rules you have to follow. Okay, because React needs to be able to understand what you're writing enough to be able to translate it into that. Okay? Okay. So a couple different rules. So notice how there's div, there's this one outer element. Okay? That has to be that way. Basic bottom line is a single chunk of JSX always has to have one outer element. Okay, so watch what happens if I try to do two outer elements. Like I tried to put a h1 that's at the same level as that div. See, I get this error that basically it's about adjacent JSX elements. You can't have two top level elements next to each other. There is a solution for it though. Okay, the original solution is you could just return an array of JSX. So what I could do is I could package this in an array. So I would just instead return an array, and I would put this JSX as the first thing, and then I would use a comma, and the second thing would be like, the h1, hello world. Okay, and see, that works. So see, first would render the first block of JSX, and then it renders the second block. But this isn't like the prettiest thing in the world. So React gave us some syntactical sugar for doing this. Okay, called a fragment. Okay, so if I wanted to do the same thing, but I wanted to look more, I don't want to mix up brackets with the HTML and just make it all, what I can do is I just do this empty tag. Okay, and that's going to do essentially the same thing. Essentially what happens is that when React sees this, it knows to take this, treat this as the first thing in an array, and this is the second thing in an array. Okay, but it just looks more HTML-like. Because again, the idea behind JSX is to make it feel like you're just using HTML. So that way you can just focus on sort of like, hey, what is the HTML logic of my page? Okay? And not to, and declare how your page should look like, instead of focusing on all this imperative JavaScript, all this like, do this first, do that second, do this third. Okay? JavaScript will figure out what's the DOM code to actually take this and put it on the screen. We just have to say, hey, this is kind of what we want things to look like. Okay. Generally, I probably, if you don't need to use a fragment, I would avoid it. Just basically make each component return one JSX, thing. Okay, and I put now here. See, this is another possible issue. So you notice how I put the JSX on a separate line in the return. Well, the return expects that whatever it's returning is on the same line. So I have two options. I can move the div back to the same line. That would work. See, we get back what I need. Or what I could do, if I do want it to look like this, I would put a parentheses here. And then I can put the closing parentheses like over here. Doesn't matter. But the idea is that it still doesn't like that unexpected token. Oh, it's because of the semicolon. Okay. See, that works because then what happens, whatever's in the parentheses is treated as the return value. Okay. So it's like, oh, you want me to return this JSX. Okay, so even though it's not on the same line, the parentheses denotes the beginning of the thing, and the closing parentheses denotes the end of the thing. That's just normal JavaScript, just in case you ever have a situation where you need to break up your return value across multiple lines, wrap it in a parentheses, and you can do that. Okay, so lessons learned so far. 1, you can only have one top-level element per JSX expression. So each JSX thing is just, you can have as many child elements, so I can have as many of these components inside the div, but there can only be one thing at the top, the div. Okay, second thing, there always must be a closing. So see, this div has a closing div tag. This header is self-closing because it has that slash. I don't have to do it that way. I could do it. I could just give it a closing tag like normal, like that. That also works. Okay, but it has to close. Okay, there can't. So for example, something like an image tag, okay, which we would normally just do like source equals whatever, and then we would just leave it like that. See, it needs to have a closing tag, or you need to self-close it. Okay, and that's going to be the same thing for inputs, whatnot. So just keep that in mind. Okay, cool. So those are like, I think like the main things, like the main pitfalls when you're first starting with JSX you need to watch out for. And again, any function that returns JSX can be used with this syntax. Okay, so it's basically a component. Okay, and even though I put this header and footer component in a separate file, you don't always have to do that. Okay, I could literally just define a function here and say function cheese was got to be uppercase. React will be upset if you don't. Anything you want to use as a component has to be uppercase because it wants to make sure that there's no collision between that and existing HTML tags. And all HTML tags are lowercase. So I would create this function and I would just say return h1 cheese. Okay, so now I can use this cheese. Because at the bottom line, all that matters is that the function is in scope. So whenever I say, hey, cheese here, it's going to look for any function that's in scope that returns JSX. Okay, and so we're like, oh, okay, cool. That works. Because again, this function here is in the scope of this file, and so that's going to be accessible to this app component. And the thing is that it would still be in scope because it's inside, if I were to define this inside that function. Because if I define it in here, it would still be in the scope of these curly brackets here. Okay, so normal scoping applies. So again, that still work. The only problem is I wouldn't be able to export that cheese in this case. I would generally avoid doing this too much, like defining a component in another component. There are reasons you would do that. Like oftentimes you might have a component that's going to change depending on how the parent this sort of enclosing component is. So in that case, you may want to redefine the component every time you use that component, but that's more advanced. I wouldn't really worry about that. Okay. And generally, there might be other better ways of handling that. Okay. So I deleted the cheese component, so I'm just going to get rid of that here. Okay, and you're going to want to make sure you download like React extensions here. So, like type in React here you'll find like different React extensions. You just find the ones that you need and install them. Try to see what I got installed regarding React. I guess not much. But I mean, this should pick up on it pretty quick. Like there should be some built-in React support in VS Code nowadays. Cool. Okay, now the cool thing is that this function app can receive, or actually any component. So let's actually let me bring back that cheese component. Or we'll just say function example. Every component, so any function that's going to be used as a component can receive one argument called props. Okay. So now the props is an object where any attributes get passed in. I'll show you what I mean. So h1. So I don't know what this props object has right now. I'm going to assume that this props object has a property called cheese. Okay. And anytime you want to inject a variable in your JSX, you're going to write this like that, and I need to make sure I return this value. So there we go. So notice I put this curly brackets. So when I put curly brackets, it's like saying, hey, the stuff in the curly brackets is JavaScript. I want you to evaluate that as JavaScript and then inject the result in there. Okay, so now if I use this component example, okay, might throw an error right now, is it? No. Right now it's not rendering anything because right now there is no props.cheese. So where would this cheese come from? Props come from the actual use of the component. So I can say here and say, hey, this thing has a props called cheese, and then equals, we'll say, and then you would use curly brackets to use some JavaScript, and I would say, hey, let's make it equal the string hello. Okay, and see, we see hello there, because what happens is that example receives an object with any props that you define like this. So when I use that example tag, I can define these attributes and I can do as many of these as I want. So it can become these really long tags. And then these get passed down as prop inside this props object. Okay, what a lot of people will do is because generally you know what props are coming in. Like you created a component or you're using some component that somebody else made and they're going to have documentation that tells you like this component has these certain props that it expects. So when you write your component, I'm going to sit there and say, okay, hey, I know I'm going to receive a prop called cheese, so I can destructure that right out there instead of just do this. Okay, so I'm using destructuring instead of saying, hey, instead of just saving that whole object called props, I'm just going to pull out the properties that I need. That way, in case someone passes me like extra props, they're not going to like flood my memory. You can do that. You don't have to do that. You could just use props, but just so you can see like that's a thing you can do. So let me just change this back to props. Because generally in the beginning, that's probably the easiest way to go. Just make it props. And the cool thing is, in your dev tools, so if I go back to my dev tools here, so that's going to be this thing called components here. Okay, let me refresh the page. So you see here, it shows me like the app component is at the top. Inside the app component, there's 3 other components rendered. And if I click on example, I can see that, hey, like this example component has a prop called cheese, okay, which equals hello. So any props you pass in, I can then inspect here in the dev tools. Okay, and that's going to be really useful for you to kind of see like what components have access to what data. Because that's where things get kind of complicated in trying to track, hey, what component has what. You have to treat each component like an island. Each piece of UI, is a blank slate unless you give it the data. Okay, so if I declare a variable here called, const cheese equals Gouda. Okay, I can use this variable inside of app. Okay, but it's not like example doesn't know that cheese variable exists. So for me to send data down from app into example, so that way example can use it, I have to pass it down as a prop. So I can go in here and say, hey, I want to give that variable cheese. So now this prop, cheese, is going to equal the value of this cheese variable inside of app. So now if I take a look at the prop here in my dev tool, see cheese equals Gouda, because I said cheese equals the cheese variable. Okay. So now when it went over here, when that h1 has props.cheese in the middle of it, and again, you can use any variable. So for example, and the cool thing is you can actually save JSX as a variable. So I can say, hey, const, some JSX, we'll call it, and then say, hey, h1 hello world. This is not a component because it's not a function that returns JSX. This would just be a variable that holds JSX, but I can inject that in there too. So I can just be like in here and say, put curly brackets and just say some JSX. And again, that's going to inject whatever that variable has there, which is, again, hello world. Because again, that's what this variable holds, the JSX h1 hello world. So again, you can use these curly brackets to inject anything. So for example, it doesn't have to be JSX. I could inject any kind of valid JavaScript expression. So I could do something like, 5 plus 5. So what does 5 plus 5 equal? 10. So see, 10 gets injected there. It takes whatever's inside the curly brackets, gets evaluated, and the end result is what's injected on the screen. Okay? So if you ever use a templating language like EJS, embedded Ruby templates, Jinja, handlebars, this kind of thing should be very familiar, where you can kind of use some sort of like, in EJS, it's like, those little squid brackets. Same, and then basically like in Jinja, it's like curly brackets, percentage brackets. You use some sort of syntax to say, okay, hey, these things should be evaluated in my template. Okay, so it kind of works in that regard. Cool. One other cool thing about JSX is that everything has a special prop called props.children. Okay, so watch this. If I want to inject props.children here, so notice I'm not going to define a prop called children. The way it works, and this is the only prop that works this way, okay? The way children works is that it's based on what's in the middle of the opening and closing tag. So this is the only time you would want an opening and closing tag for your component, because anything in the middle of it would be treated as the children. So if I wrote hello world here, okay, and I go back here and I click and check out that component, see it has a prop called children that equals hello world. It's whatever is in the middle between the opening and closing tag. Okay, and then I can inject that into here, props.children. Okay, so just again, it's just another way to pass information down. You know, usually like you might want to do this if you wanted to wrap other HTML in a particular way. Again, it's just something you can do if it makes sense for you to do so. But yeah, so again, recap. Whenever you pass information in between the opening and closing tag, it doesn't automatically show up. So again, if I were to take this out and just swap this out with like just the word cheese, see, only the word cheese shows up there. But if I take a look at example, see the hello world is still that props.children. So that data is just being passed right into the component, but it doesn't necessarily mean I use it. I have to actually use the data. Any props, just because they exist doesn't mean I'm using them. I have to actually use them in my JSX or use them in the function somehow. A component is just a function that returns JSX. Every component, so that function can define an argument called props, and that props is made up of any data that's passed in via the actual use of the component. Okay, so again, I could do like, and then the props can be called anything. So I can just put like, prop called we equals cheese. Okay, and then if I go over here, see like now there's a prop called we that equals Gouda, that cheese variable we declared earlier, because I said we equals cheese. Okay, but anytime I want to use JavaScript in the middle of my JSX, I have to use curly brackets. Essentially, think of the curly brackets as saying, hey, I'm going to use JavaScript. So anything in that curly brackets is JavaScript, but it has to return a value. It has to be a JavaScript expression, not a JavaScript statement. Now, what's the difference between a JavaScript statement and a JavaScript expression? A statement just means like you said to do a thing, but there's no end result. It's like an if statement. An if statement doesn't give you back anything. But putting down like a variable, that's an expression because the result is the variable. A mathematical statement like this 5 plus 5, that is an expression because it returns the result of 5 plus 5. A function call is an expression because it returns the return value of the function. But whatever the result is, it has to return. There has to be sort of like a end result, and that end result is what gets spat out by the curly brackets. So in this case, we equals the end result of the variable cheese, which is just the value of the variable. Okay, so that is JSX. Okay, and how to use JSX in a more, we covered a lot here. The best thing to do is play around. Just try to create like a website and just like create different components. Like always, I like to say, hey, create like your navigation bar in your header, create like a footer in your footer, and just kind of see how that plays out and play with that. And like first, just play with that in your JSX. Get used to sort of like how these things are relating to each other and checking your dev tools before we move on to the next topic, which is state. That's going to help you sort of like, the best way they appreciate this is just to kind of keep doing it over and over again. So generally, again, building that header, building that footer is going to give you sort of the best flavor for all that. So my name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great day and enjoy.